Welcome to RevOps Revolution, where we focus on changing the game for driving revenue. I'm your host, Jesse Morris, and each episode we take a look at the different areas that affect change and drive revenue across your organization. If this is your first time joining us, please subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episode. Here's to the revolution. Welcome to another day of the revolution. I'm your host, Jesse Morris, and today we have one of my colleagues, Michael Heuer. Heuer, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
Awesome. So Heuer, I'm really excited today. Heuer has been a sales leader in EMEA for a number of years, consistently runs top performing teams. I like having various perspectives on the podcast. He's one of the most operationally minded sales leaders I've come across, and I think that's one of the reasons I really was excited to have the conversation today, because he has a knack for RevOps. His ability to analyze data, provide recommendations, look at optimization, and even modeling. One of the models you did the other day was really fun. And really, obviously, all balancing that with the ability to perform and drive revenue. I've always appreciated your directness, your willingness to challenge organizations to continuously improve. And I think you do bring the best out of those around you. So thanks again for joining. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the compliment, being direct. So being German, that's part of my nature, apparently. Yeah, so as you said, I've been in the business quite a while. So I started at some point as a developer, went into some software companies as a sales rep in different roles across Germany, Europe later, and then went into leadership roles. So for like 25 years, I'm in sales leadership roles, managing regions like DACH or Central Europe, EMEA, Southeast Asia. And so, yeah, always have been interested in RevOps. As you said, I like to say it's my hobby. That sometimes scares people away, but it's not meant to be in a bad way. It's for me more like to make sure I really understand how numbers come together, and how to make sound decisions on go-to-market strategies, for example. So therefore, yeah, that's me.
Awesome. Talk to me a little bit, I'd love some insight. How did you derive that more operationally minded approach to leadership? Was it something you always had, or something you've continued to hone over the years?
Actually, it started with the fact that I didn't really know what sales means, I have to say. So I was a developer, developed software, and then I thought, like, how the heck do I sell it? And that kind of got me into sales. And then later, when I was running sales teams, I was like, how do I really make sure I have them heading into the right direction, targeting the right customers, setting the right targets, and so forth. So there were a couple of smaller companies I worked for back then. And so a lot of the stuff I had to make up on the fly, and there wasn't really something, because it was one of the very first global ISPs, Unet, where I was working in my very first sales role. So a lot of things had to be built from scratch. And that kind of got me into this, because there wasn't any like proper CRM back then. There wasn't any proper RevOps tool, or sales ops as I call it back then. There wasn't no comp plan for these kind of things, et cetera, et cetera. So this got me started more or less into this whole thing. And I really wanted to understand the background of how things coming together, really. And that got me into it.
How did you move from developer to sales? What was that transition? What prompted the transition?
To some degree, I didn't really want to be anymore behind the computer at night programming stuff. I have no clue anymore what I did program the next day when I was looking at it. So I thought, like, it might be a good idea to move to the other side of the table by really knowing how to sell, but you have some knowledge. It killed almost my very first customers, because when I was turning into a sales role, I thought the best idea is to tell them everything I knew and to give them the best advice ever. And some of the early customers said, like, wow, I never really had that kind of good talk and so much detail about stuff. So I even had presentations for a piece of software for like 3 hours, and people then went away like, I really have to think about whether I can ever use it as well as you. So, and then I learned they never came back and never bought anything. So it switched like, okay, maybe too much knowledge is a problem, but if you have a lot of knowledge, it helps actually to understand a lot of the tech stuff I was selling back then, because I was always selling, let's say, very new products like Lotus Notes. When it came into the market, brand new, nobody knew how to sell it, and I kind of figured it out. when we were selling internet access and services. Nobody was selling it back then, and I had to figure it out. So it helped me to understand what I really have there, but I also had to learn, like, to unlearn almost that knowledge I have in my head. Otherwise, I kill people. And the same still happens to me these days when I talk about data stuff. Yeah, so as you know, I like to throw data at people and say, like, this is not how it works. But yeah, that is more or less the switch I've made.
It's fun, man. It's funny because I think a lot of times you a lot of people think of sales reps and they think of the super social, person that likes to be out and extrovert, and it is interesting because I've had a lot of these conversations now, and it's fascinating because you have some of those, but actually you have a lot more than you would think that are kind of more, I would say, more used to being geeky nerd side like myself,
Hmm.
that love that side of it, but have also figured out how to kind of grow into some of these other skill sets to kind of bridge the two, which I think is really powerful.
Yeah, one of the early things, if I recall, like, what was, let's say, rev ops, sales ops, like, something it was my second company, Lotus, when I was working for them. And back then, the local manager there decided always when a lead came in, like, who gets it? Yeah, and I really was pissed off because usually the guys who were longer with the company got the interesting stuff, and I got the crumbles, from everything. And some point, I thought, like, okay, we were like, I can't remember anymore, 4 or 5 reps back then in that territory. And I thought, well, there must be a better way of distributing it. Yeah, so kind of proposed, like, shouldn't we have something like a vertical approach? Yeah, so that we really speak the language. Yeah, selling Lotus Notes back then, which might be helpful if you sell either to a bank or to an insurance company, whatever. And then what he didn't know, though, was what I did. Yeah, I was looking at all the existing customer base we've had. I looked at, like, what is the relationship between, let's say, a vertical like energy supply companies, how many employees they have, which I could look up in some special books back then. There wasn't any online thing. And how much PCs they had, because logically, yeah, the more PCs they have, the more employees they have, the more licenses they can buy. Yeah, and if you have a lot of white collar workers, these guys, of course, have a lot of PCs. They need a software like Lotus 123. Yeah, for those who don't know this anymore, it's like Excel today. And Lotus Notes was the other thing we wanted to sell. So I picked, of course, verticals, which had the majority of the PCs, which nobody really figured out back then. And that was one of the reasons why I was one of the most successful sales guys back then, because I convinced everybody, I take those verticals, you guys take these verticals, and they were very happy with some verticals. They never really figured out why part of my success was just picking the right verticals, right? And that was probably one of my early things of getting into RevOps, or do some better planning before you go to the market.
It's interesting. I was a rep for a number of years, and similarly, like, I got very detailed. I mean, no surprise, right? I was very process oriented, and we had this campaign. It was like a top 50 target hit list account, and this was back before a lot of the research you're seeing today with LinkedIn and all these tools that reps are doing to really understand it. And so similarly, I was like, pulling off random data sets, but really I got good with messaging because I understood, kind of more the vertical side of things and how I was messaging things. And I ended up winning this competition. A lot of people were like, what did you do? And I was literally just looking at data, and then I just mapped out a process and executed on it. Whereas everybody else was just kind of clicking down their list, trying to go through it. So it's amazing how, probably today it's a little harder because tools, have made it easier for everybody to do it. But at the same time, people have to want to use those tools and actually leverage those tools, which is a big part of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when you think about, the operational approach within sales, what are some of those foundational areas you think provide your team that edge? Like, what, we've talked to probably a few of those, but what would you say foundationally some of those keys are?
You mean like today or in general?
Yeah, today, like, as you're running your sales org and you think about the operational side and some of the things that you're instilling into your teams, what are some of the things that can help provide your team that edge that you were taking an edge on back in the day?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's almost the same thing like when I take over teams in general. So whether I start with a company like Keep It, where we just went into the market more or less from scratch here in my region, or if I take over teams, there's a certain set of questions I always ask from the beginning, and it's super basic, to be honest. And I'm always surprised how often these questions haven't been answered before properly. I mean, there's sometimes some high-level answers, but they're not really good usually that they can be used. So some of these questions are like, what is the ideal customer profile? Yeah, what are the ideal verticals? Of course, yeah, coming back to the vertical question. What are typical sizes? Yeah, who are the typical decision makers or personas we have to go after? What is the messaging you need in order to convince these personas? What are typical deal sizes? What are the typical price points? Yeah, so all these things I like to figure out ideally at the beginning. I also do a typical SWOT exercise, yeah, especially when I have some team members who are coming in already or have some experience with the market or territory I'm working in. To really work that out. And interesting enough, very often, even those reps, sometimes who are there for some time, they look at this after we've done a workshop to go through it. They look at this and they think like, wow, we haven't really thought about this, but that's true. And it's so helpful to understand this now that you have that kind of written down in a certain way. Of course, then all the rest comes behind that, like, okay, how do we now get to these type of customers? Yeah, what kind of marketing do you want to do? Or you think is successful, what has worked in the past, and you can measure stuff. So all that comes afterwards. So doing this kind of planning and thinking before you run, yeah, is something which I think is essential. It doesn't take a lot of time, yeah, but it also helps to get to know your team better when you have a team you inherited. It helps to bond the team, yeah, because they kind of sweating together on these kind of exercise, and that helps them to really get the ball rolling into the right direction.
What is that format? Is that typically like a couple day workshop? How are you running that question session to bring everybody together?
Yeah, usually depends on how much time I have, right? But usually it's like a 2-day offsite type of thing I do, where I throw these kind of basic questions into it, and then sometimes it's a question of how far you can get. You know? I don't like to have meetings where you just look at PowerPoints and you go through data and look at slides which you can read anyway otherwise. Yeah. So I rather like to have meetings when I meet my sales guys or managers to really chew on these kind of questions, you know, which really help for everybody to make up their mind, like what really makes sense, what doesn't make sense. Yeah, and also here at Keep It, I had that some of my guys at the beginning when we all came together, it was a fresh team that was formed. And some of the guys were like, "Oh, really? I want to be out there and sell." Yeah. And then once they were through these workshops, they always like, "Oh, it was so useful." And you know, salespeople do want to do this stuff. Yeah, if they can really get something out of it. If it's a meaningless exercise, you do a very high level exercise and you just have some fluffy answers there, it doesn't help anybody. So there has to be something which gives you some teeth. And yeah, bringing the teams together definitely helps. You know, and 3 days are usually enough. You know, if you really have to do it in one day, you can do it, but it's better. Yeah, people get into a certain flow and working that out.
So it's interesting. One of the topics that I talk to my team a lot about is, are we working on the right things? That's the question I'm always asking them, is not are we working hard, not are we working, but are we working on the right things? And I would imagine some of what you're talking about actually is helping define the right things. How are you
Mm-hmm.
using kind of that foundation you build it? Because in those 2 days, I'm sure people are like aha moments, but they still have their habits, right? How are you
Mm-hmm.
reinforcing what you did in those 2 day workshops to really answer that question?
Well, it's a bit broad to answer. So it's probably a mix because ideally you get out of it when you really do such a transformational workshop with a few actions you agree together. And very often I do set objectives outside the regular thing like you have to hit your target. Yeah, obviously you have to hit your target. That's a no-brainer for a salesperson. But you know, sometimes I define either best practices, you know, which are kind of connected to that, what was the outcome, or I set objectives which are either relating to best practices we've agreed or not agreed. Yeah, sometimes I just set them. So so you know, these kind of soft objectives, I mean, still in a smart way, you know, so measured, etc. So they help to steer the right behavior into a certain direction. What I'm not a big fan of is like just counting input. Yeah, because yes, somebody can make a lot of calls, a lot of meetings, yeah, but I really like to see the output. And if you measure output, like how's the funnel developing or how many seats you might have to find each quarter, is then helping to shape also the right behavior. So fun story here from this company, but I had it before as well. I always got this complaint like, oh, we need more leads, we need more opportunities, we need more whatever, yeah, deal recs, etc. And at some point I turned it around and said, guys, tell me how many seats do you need each quarter, each month, whatever, in order to hit your target. Yeah. Fun fact was nobody could answer it. By the way, me either. I also haven't made the calculation yet. Yeah. And then I did the calculation, and then we could really have a proper discussion about like, do we have enough deal recs and enough leads coming in? And of course, then you look at all the other stuff like conversion rates, etc. But of course, it sets a different behavior or creates a different behavior. If you say like, I need whatever 30,000 seats identified and qualified each quarter, and you think after 2 months I'm at 10K, then I have to do something for 30K, right? And I can't just wait for marketing to send me some leads. I have to do some other activities like visiting partners, encouraging them, etc. So this is how I make sure, by setting smart targets, objectives, sometimes OKRs, to drive the right behavior.
So you hit on something that I've thought a lot about in sales. And if you look at top reps and you look at top performing teams, typically it's the thing that you just said around marketing. And it's the, instead of being, you hear a lot of, well, I'm not getting enough leads, so I'm not performing. But what you just said actually is very telling. It's the thing that I agree a lot too, is at the end of the day, you're still responsible for the output. And so if you're not getting it, you're taking ownership and saying, okay, what can I do? Forget what I can get. If I get something marketing, great. But at the end of the day, this is not coming in. I got to go figure this out.
Yeah.
Part of that's taking that ownership. What are some of those other kind of foundational things like that you feel like consistently lead to success over time within sales?
Well, it's to install a learning culture and also what I like to call an honest culture. Yeah, there's this fun book which I never read, but because I read the title and it explains everything, which is The Speed of Trust.
Never heard of it. Who's it by?
It's a yeah. Apparently, it's a good book. Yeah, I think I even have it somewhere, but I read it like many other books. Yeah, but I thought the title is really interesting because at the end, if you really think about it, the speed of trust means a lot. Yeah, and can mean of course a lot. But if I talk to my boss about a deal and say like we need to really do something here on the price side, of course he can try to now examine the whole thing to the very last detail, or he does trust me that I'm not going to come with bullshit. And the same applies if I work with my guys. The same applies if you work on a forecast. And I mean, I find this really funny, the culture very often, which I keep on hearing from a lot of companies, American or whatever companies, they have this culture of you have to forecast your target. And this is something completely odd for me because yes, of course I can do this and I can plug some deals together if I hopefully have enough to make up the story, I can make my target. But that never really tells me where I'm really at. Yeah, and then people are really surprised that deals are slipping and moving and whatever. And over the last years, I mean, I don't want to say I haven't tried that as well, that kind of method. Yeah, so I failed with that method too. And I'm a big advocate for now, and you know it from our daily operations here, that I like to really understand, like, okay, is it really real, that deal for that quarter, or is it not? Yeah, and it starts with very simple things like a close date and sales stage. Because if you're in an early sales stage and you usually need 6 months to get through it, it doesn't make sense to forecast that in the same quarter. Yeah, it's rather going to be out there, and you might want to pull it forward again, but don't try to pretend you're going to close it in 3 months or 2 weeks or whatever, just because you have to in order to hit your forecast, yeah, or in the forecast is your goal. So this whole mantra of predictability beats reaching the goal. No, I think it sounds different. Anyway, so but you know what I mean, yeah. So that you really become predictable in terms of what you can close and will close is more important than just pretending any number. That comes back to a question of, is there enough trust in the system? Yeah, if the rep can't tell me I need more time, I need better price, I need better help or more help from yourself or whatever, then you're never going to have an honest conversation where you are. You can't work on stuff that need to be done. Yeah, if you don't have the right partners, not the right marketing, not the right SE or whatever, yeah, whatever might stop him of being successful, that conversation doesn't happen if you don't have a culture of having an open conversation, an honest conversation, and where you can ask for help. That should not say that I'm not going to push my guys. It should not say, we are in a communist sales system or something. Yeah, it's still a very performance-driven system. But let's talk honestly about that, what's going on, and then you can work it out and you can address topics which need to be addressed.
Within that, like, is there something you see within reps? I mean, you've hired, I don't know how many, are you actually, how many hires, how many people, how many reps do you think you've hired in your career?
Couple of hundred.
Okay.
I
So when
think
you look at that,
I think we need to do the math at some point. Yeah.
yeah, like when you look at that, like what now looking back, because I'm sure you made some bad hires just like I have in my career, what are some of those foundational, just, not a lot, but some of the things that you're looking for when you're making those hires?
Hmm. Um, It reminds me of a discussion I had once with an American sales VP, which interviewed me for a role. And I gave him this long list of things I'm looking at, and include things like these guys should have wrinkles or bad, a dark shade under the eyes, because then I can see they work long hours, and they must smile. I can see still some smiling here in the eyes and stuff like that. So they're fun to work with. So I gave him this long list, and he was like, "Yeah, I like it all, but I can say it's in a much faster way." And I said, "Okay, tell me." And he said, "Well, I can teach somebody everything, but I can't teach him the desire to win." And I think that's something which really clicked with me. If I don't find that desire to win, if somebody really wants to be successful and he has kind of proven it with not necessarily just in sales stuff, and I'm going to come up with an example in a second, then if you don't see this desire to win in some shape or form, and you can't describe it or can give examples which shows this kind of desire to win, then it's probably very likely the wrong person to hire. And of course, there are all kinds of other things you can look at. I also like that book called The Ideal Team Player. This talks about smart, humble, and hungry.
Yep.
And that hungry, of course, relates back to the desire to win. And I think the other two elements, which are kind of clicked for me as well a lot over time, because if they're not smart, have some intelligent way of acting and working, and humble also in terms of working together with your colleagues and being coachable, then it's really becoming difficult, because just having an ego shooter who can do great deals. And I had one lady at some point, which was a great shooter, but when she came into the office and had a bad mood, the entire floor was down. So that doesn't really help. It doesn't create the right culture again. So smart, humble, hungry, is that what I'm looking for? And of course, there are different ways of checking it out. And then one example I have here, which is just an SDR I recently hired. So it was a kind of funny thing how I found him, because he was a waiter and sommelier at a restaurant where we were just before the famous Oktoberfest, with our founders and my boss. And the guy was so good that we thought, like, that would be a great SDR for us. And so at the end, we hired him. But the interesting thing is, because I let them all pitch something to tell us a story like about themselves. Yeah. So what is their background and what moves them? What career decisions have they made so far? And this guy, the very first thing he showed in his presentation was a Rubik cube. Yeah, this thing which you have to fiddle to get the colors in the right shape. And he told the story when he was 8, 9 years old. He found that thing on a back seat of his friend's car, or his friend's father's car. And he said, "What is that?" And he tried to solve it, and he couldn't. Yeah, but then he got so hooked on it that he taught himself how to solve it in less than 10 seconds. And he was one of the best guys in Germany back then of solving it. Of course, they're much faster guys these days, but 10 seconds at the age of whatever, 9, 10, it does tell a story. Yeah, that is a desire to win. And this is what I'm looking for, these kind of bits, which is showing there's something more than, of course, all the good stuff that the sales guy can talk about.
It's interesting because when I've done a lot, I've done a lot of hiring, but especially recently, and I always talk about three things, and one of those is, I like winning. I like being, I obviously say it's the people I get to work with, it's the size of the problems I get to solve, and it's the ability to win. And I think, as it's very similar, even in my area, which I'm not hiring for sales, but and Lencioni's, ideal team player is very similar blueprint. I use that a lot too, because I think you're right. It does provide that framework, and that's something you can't teach, right? They either have it or they don't have it. And so that's, I like the story of how how you're sussing out if they have that desire. It's something I need to start thinking through hiring going forward, because that is a hard, it's not overly hard to suss out, but I do think I like your approach of, hey, tell me a story about this. So that's fun.
Yeah, a lot of the sales today is storytelling at the end. Yeah, and actually, that exercise didn't come from me. It was a former company who asked actually sales engineers in Germany. Yeah, and they gave this very typical, let's say, English American thing like, tell us about yourself. Yeah, and how did you make up your career? And what happened then was that those poor sales engineers back then, German sales engineers, they said, okay, they want me to talk about myself. So they used their CV and put it into chronological order, yeah, and presented more or less the text in that presentation, at that part of the presentation they had to give. And they were all failing. Yeah, and I said, like, guys, but these are really good sales engineers. Some of them I did know. Yeah, and at some point I asked, like, what do you really expect out of it? Yeah, well, we want them to see like how they can tell a story, because at the end, a lot of the stuff how we're doing it when we're selling our product is telling a story about the product. And I said, okay, fine, but then tell these guys, you have to tell a German, that that he has to tell a story. You can tell him, and this is what I do these days. I tell them, you can be funny, you can show pictures, it can be entertaining. Yeah, don't just show us a CV, just show us with pictures. Yeah, what is your story? And it's amazing what stories you see when you do that. Yeah, because you see a lot of, let's say, motivation, what drives them, what other values they have. So usually never really anybody fails in that kind of exercise. It's just one of them I'm using to assess people when I hire them, and by the way, for any role. But you also sometimes think like, wow, that's a boring person. So, and then very often afterwards, you also find some stuff which is not really that successful, yeah, or where you think like, okay, that might not be the person I really want to hire. But that part is quite interesting and also a bit entertaining. And of course, it also eases up the person a bit when they're pitching, and gives for everybody some insight about that person.
Oh, I like it. I like it. I'm going to start using it going forward. You talked a little bit, obviously, you've spent a ton of time in Europe. That's where the majority of your career is. I think a lot of listeners, maybe don't have a lot of experience there or limited. And I think it's easy to say, well, Europe, I've heard a lot. I've been on both sides of it where I've heard Europe is very different. I've also heard it's similar, sales is sales is sales. You hear that on both ends of it. From your perspective, like, talk to me a little bit. What is it like leading a sales team? And so not only from a team perspective, but then also driving sales in Europe, do you see differences? And if so, what are those? And where do you think the similarities are?
Mm. Yeah, when I had my very first leadership role, I was going really on the nerves of my back then EMEA VP. And every time she came to Germany, I said, hey, that might apply for everywhere, but Germany is very different. Yeah, and then when I later had a role in that company where I was heading up a region, yeah, with a couple of countries, and any country I came to, everybody was like, yeah, that might work somewhere, but Austria, Switzerland, Hungary, Russia, even back then I was managing, yeah, it's very different. Yeah, and I then at some point I got back to her and said like, hey, Pat, I have to say, sorry for bothering you with this phrase of everything is so different. Yeah, it's not really. However, there are differences. I usually like to compare when I work with a new company, that whole thing with like putting a soup together or cooking a soup. Yeah, so the ingredients are usually quite the same, and I have to learn how this company has been successful in cooking that soup. Yeah, where 80-90% of the ingredients will be very likely the same, but the last 10% might be the little difference, which is making it more tasty for whatever, the Germans, the Dutch, or you name it. And that's the part where I'm saying this is, I have to trust you on the 80-90%. You have to trust me on the 10-20% when I'm telling you we might need a twist, and that is something how I look at the world today, yeah, because there's a lot of commonalities. However, if you look at a couple of things, I'll just take an example from my previous company where I had the pleasure to work with somebody together who was an American managing Benelux, and he was supposed to help me, and then I rather almost advised him on Benelux because I managed Benelux also at some point. And he and I talked about like what are the differences between selling a security product in US versus selling it here in Europe, in this case in Netherlands. And yeah, there are some things which are easy to find, but not very common knowledge. So a CISO in the US is usually somebody reporting to the board, has some budget. Yeah, as a rule of thumb in Europe, you have a CISO who usually have no power, reports to the CIO, has no budget. Yeah, so and usually the guy who's always complaining about, oh, we have to do more on security. Yeah, he's the ugly guy nobody wants to talk to. Yeah, the bad child or whatever. That's a typical difference. You know, and you don't just walk. And I had this many times, and I never really got it until I asked my colleague here back then. I asked him, like, is it really the case that the CRO walks into yeah, the board or to the CIO and say, like, hey, let's do a deal, kind of handshake agreement? And he said, yeah, actually in the US that happens quite a lot. I said, okay, forget it in Europe. And he said, yeah, I know. Yeah, I figured that out as well already. Yeah, that it doesn't work. And of course, the CIO back then pushed all the time, oh, let me get in front of the customer, I do it. And said, we always said in Europe, no, no, please don't, yeah, because that breaks the process and it kills us. Yeah, procurement is way more powerful in Europe than maybe in the US. I've never sold really in the US, so I don't want to really make a call on that necessarily. But usually I keep on hearing this also when I talk to people from the US and try to compare things. Then you find that, for example. Another great example I found working back then for Akamai. And Akamai was, yeah, one of the propositions they had back then was to accelerate a website so you can click, yeah, especially when you have an e-commerce site, it's a question of how fast it reacts, and the faster it reacts, the more likely the people is continue to buy. And here's the interesting thing. I talked to the lady who was selling to all the e-commerce companies back then in America, and she had signed up like 249 of the top 250. Yeah, and I was trying to figure out, okay, when you're so successful, how can I be successful in Germany? And she said, well, you know, when I sell it, you know, it's more or less I tell them the story, and if they see there's a potential advantage, the response from a typical American customer is, okay, let's try it. Yeah, let's do it, because the potential win is bigger than any kind of risk I might have, or it doesn't work, whatever. Yeah, but if I can win something, let's try. In Germany, it's completely the opposite. Yeah, so they want to have a complete detailed spec. Then they want to analyze why it works. Then they're going to tell you 5 times it doesn't work for their website. Then they want to run at least 5 POCs, you know, proof of concepts, in order to prove it. And then they still think like, yeah, there might be an accident that it's working. So it's a complete bizarre thing. Yeah, so completely risk averse, not taking an opportunity to gain something. It's rather the chance to say no to something.
Right.
And I wouldn't generalize it in general, but this is a very typical thing, yeah, where you have like the typical, yeah, the very different buying behaviors. Yeah, the sales process is probably still the same to a good degree, but how much time you need to get to certain points is often very different. And yeah, these are just a few examples of where things are different.
So it's interesting, you know, this is really I've worked with other international companies, but this is the first time I've worked with an international based company. And as somebody who buys probably the most software in the company, buying software, you know, my current role with an international based company is substantially more painful than buying in the US. Just the number of hurdles you have to jump through on a legal and InfoSec, obviously GDPR and some of the other requirements. But to your point, even some of the questions I get, it's a different, you know, game in buying that. So I've experienced that as somebody who buys a lot of software. And so I actually think a lot of what you said is rings true when you compare the two, because like even recently I bought a tool, and in order to get it through legal and InfoSec quickly, I just bought it for the US as a pilot, because I was like, I just want to prove the concept out. I don't want to
Yeah.
get bogged down for 2 months in buying this thing. I just want to move quickly, see if this thing
Mhm.
works, to your point. And then
Mhm.
if it doesn't, no big deal. The risk was
Yeah.
low. It wasn't, but if it's, you know, has a ROI, then I can go back to the business and say, hey, okay, legal InfoSec, this is the results we've gotten here. You know, here's what we could do here. Are we
Mhm.
interested in doing something like that? So
Yeah.
it's fascinating to hear you say that. And now, like, me thinking through it, there's definitely reality to it.
Yeah, and of course there are other things. Yeah, so Germans like to talk about data protection and go really into the details. Others don't. Yeah, and you know, also if you look at Office 365, yeah, so the adoption rate in Germany is maybe 40-50%. There are no really good figures you can get, but let's say this is roughly the case. If you look at other regions, everything is on cloud. Yeah, if you go to Benelux, Nordics, whatever, yeah, there's 70, 80, 90% are in the cloud already with Office. So just one example. Or and then there are other things which are easily forgotten. Yeah, and this is a little bit towards my American friends here in general, or American software companies coming to Europe. Europe is not one country. Yeah, and Benelux is not a country. DACH also, is not a country. Nordics is not a country. These are multiple countries. And if you then dive into the details, then you know, the Germans sending to Austria, yeah, they speak both German, but a very different accent, and not necessarily. I mean, the Germans usually like the Austrians. It's not usually the case that the Austrians like the Germans when they would sell to them. The same applies with the Swiss. Yeah, so Swiss people coming to Germany, no issue. Yeah, actually, everybody likes them. Yeah, they're neutral. Yeah, it's not the same thing if the Germans come to Switzerland. It's different. Yeah, the same applies between Netherlands and Belgium, or even between Danish and Swedish people. Yeah, so there are a lot of little things which I'm not saying they are necessarily stopping everything, but it's easy to say sometimes like, oh, why don't you hire a guy in whatever? Yeah, he can cover the entire region. No, not really. Yeah, so if you really want to be successful, you have to become more localized, more regionalized. That should not say that the sales process is really so much different. The product has to be changed, but there are things like that, yeah, which play an important role if you really want to be successful, and that's very often forgotten.
Well, and I think weirdly enough, I don't think, I think on the opposite end of it, obviously being, working for a lot of American companies, and I'm from different parts of the country, and even within the States, like the South is its own different
Mm.
culture, right? And so in the East Coast, we kind of have a similar culture, and you know, I'm live out in the West, and I would say even a different one there. But there are definitely parts even within the states that have that, and so it's interesting that, and I've seen it. You see that mentality of, oh, we're going to Europe and we'll just hire one person for all this. But the funny thing is, in the
Yeah.
States, you would never do that. So it's an ironic, kind of dichotomy between the two across it too. So it happens here as well, which is fascinating.
Yeah, one colleague made a funny thing at some point because, you know, like many software companies these days, that everybody likes to work with internal recruiters, or like to use very often English headhunters, yeah, to hunt people down also in Germany. And at some point, it was so bad that people were putting into their LinkedIn profile, "Don't call me if you're a UK headhunter or if you're a headhunter at all." And I tried to convince that company I was working for back then to like, okay, can we please use somebody more local? And I couldn't make any progress. And there was one guy, quite senior guy, who was kind of my mentor in the company. And at some point, he went to the recruiting team in the US and said, "Hey, you know what? I got this really great French headhunter. Yeah, we should really look with this guy for people in California." And they were like, "Why would I do that?" Yeah, and it's like, okay, why do you use UK guys hunting down people in Germany? Yeah, so, and that made it click. Yeah, but sometimes it's really, yeah, that kind of switch you have to make in order to get the absurdity of these kind of things sometimes, yeah, in any company. And by the way, before we get it wrong here, I'm not want to say like it's just American companies. Yeah, so I had a big debate with some guy at some point, like, yeah, all these American companies don't really get it how to work here in Europe or Germany. And so guess what? Yeah, if you work for Siemens in Brazil, yeah, just an example, and I never worked for Siemens, but I'm pretty sure that the Brazilian guy will say these bloody Germans have no clue how to operate in Brazil. Yeah, so it's natural, and we have seen it here also here at Keep It. You know, we had a couple of attempts how to approach the US market. You just don't know, yeah, and this is perhaps one of the things I also apply a lot when I pick up sales teams or I build something new. My basic assumption, I have no clue. You know, that's my assumption. I walk into it, and that's probably a better assumption than trying to tell everybody like how you should do it, because you know, I have some idea about how to sell in the Netherlands because I managed teams there, but I was successful because I picked the right guy who was running it for me. And without Hans was his name back then in Akamai, yeah, I never had built a proper Akamai business ever in Benelux, but you know, I kept his back free and I was you know, supporting him where I could, yeah, being his manager. But it was him building it, yeah. But it was a local guy who made it successful. And the same applies for any European company coming to the US. You need to hire locals in order to be successful. And if you don't do this, you're going to fail. And the same applies for any country in Germany or Africa or Asia Pac, you know, because we haven't talked yet about the whole way of communication. Yeah, Germans being very direct. You started with that. Yeah, and very often that's my problem, by the way. In a lot of companies in the past, because I speak properly, proper English, I would say. But yeah, it does not mean that I really hear the nuances, yeah, between certain things I'm saying and being perceived by a Native American. Yeah, so sometimes I come across very rude, and I wasn't meant rude. Yeah, and
Yep.
in the last example, sorry for going on this one, but It just reminds me of a funny debate I had with a lady from Poland at some point at a previous company, and she was really freaking out at some point in the meeting because I was saying this is the problem and we have to work on that. And at some point she freaked out and said like, "Oh, you keep on talking about problems." And I said, "Okay, what's your point?" And it came out that for her, and I'm not sure if it's a Polish thing, I really don't know, but
No.
it seems like that. For her, problem means, yeah, I name it, and then it's end of the whole thing. It's done. You're out. You're done. Nothing can be done anymore. For German, talking about a problem is the first step. You talk about the problem, then you talk about the solution. You want to name it, yeah, and that's something which I find quite amazing, and that happens also if you that's something actually I was reading this article about talk about problems actually, yeah, like and I had this right afterwards in a meeting, so I was talking to an English guy was actually in that meeting, and he was going on like, "Oh, there's a tiny bit of a challenge on this topic." Yeah, and I thought like, just before he said it's a really big problem. Yeah, so why is he now suddenly saying it's a little bit of a challenge? And I was like, "What do you mean by a little bit of a challenge?" Because I take it by the word as a German. Yeah, it's not a
No.
little bit of a challenge; it's a bloody big challenge. Yeah, or problem actually. And yeah, it was a complete different way of looking at stuff, but in saying it in their culture. Yeah, and of course, Germans very often take it completely wrong when your manager says, "You may want to think about it." Yeah, I like it, but you may want to think about it. Okay. An English guy will understand immediately. Oh, okay, I fucked up. Yeah, for a German, oh yeah, he liked me, and I just have to think about it. So yeah, that's the kind of cultural thing which comes into it, which is of course no way off of RevOps, but it comes back to that, that you, even if you talk about numbers and issues and challenges, yeah, it can be perceived very differently when you talk to different cultures, not to speak about Asian, etc.
Well, and actually, I would say it's not. I think a lot of people thinks it's way off RevOps, but I actually would say one of the most important jobs of RevOps that's often missed is change management, right? So it's
Mm.
easy to move quickly. You and I've seen that too, especially when we're moving 100 miles per hour and maybe we don't have a ton of resources and time frames and all that. But obviously, not taking that time and understanding, especially culturally, I think it's a good point. So I actually think it applies directly to RevOps. It's something that's probably less talked about and underestimated. Even myself, at times, I get so caught up in I need to
Mm.
execute, I need to do that. I was thinking about it this morning actually on something else that came up where I was like, ooh, I need to take a step back and make sure that I mapped out all the stakeholders this could impact. So before I go and do development on this big project, have I actually check boxes, if you will, with all those key stakeholders? So I actually think it has a lot of application, and even how you do that, right? The process of getting that buy-in. And when you do it, and so yeah, I think there's a lot of relevancy to how, because I do think change management is one of the most underestimated sides of revenue operations.
Yeah, very likely. And in sales as well, because if you don't motivate guys coming with you, you can tell them how many meetings they should have, before we're back to input orientation, but it's not going to happen, yeah, because if they're not convinced, then nothing will happen and change.
Final question. This has been awesome. If you could give some advice to a younger you when you first started as a sales leader in particular, what advice would you give a younger sales leader, maybe starting out or wants to improve where they're at? What would be some, 3 to 5 solid pieces of advice you'd give them looking back at it?
I think one of the very first things is something it's not for me, but it's a great phrase. The soft things are the hard things. Yeah, so all that stuff, and we just talked about it, like this communication part, working with people, that's the soft stuff. And in my early days, I thought like, yeah, whatever. Yeah, so you brush over it and think everybody thinks the same or must think the same, or of course they must see it that there is an issue or a chance or whatever. So these soft things are the hard things. Yeah, it's all about communication. It's all about taking people with you, making sure they have a chance to follow, to digest, and so forth. So the hard stuff is the soft stuff. Yeah. So this is something you really have to get right. Um, and then if you're good with people and the soft stuff, then the other big thing is, yeah, find the right people, hire the right guys. And very often especially, and I did the mistake many times, I have to say, that if you're under pressure to find people, especially when you grow fast and you know you need to have like 5, 10 salespeople by X, yeah, in order to make the number next year, because you're good on rev ops or you have a great rev ops colleague who telling you like if you don't hire by then you have no chance to make the number. Then at some point you brush over the process, you talk yourself into something like that person is great and it's not. Yeah, so it's good to have somebody who's telling you the truth. Maybe you want to think about that guy you want to hire, but you know, hiring the right people is everything, because if you don't have the right team with you, then yeah, there's no chance you're going to win. Yeah, you cannot be the big dancer in front of everybody and just believe this is enough, because my job as a sales leader is to make my team successful. I only can be successful if I hire really strong people who are opinionated and have the desire to win, as we talked about it. So yeah, be good with people, yeah, hire the right guys, and last but not least, be good with numbers, because if you don't understand how the numbers come together and what the processes are in the right markets, etc., I all consider this as numbers to a certain degree, then there's no way you're going to head into the right direction. You know, and it makes a big difference if you even have the best team on earth, you send them in that direction, but that direction is the right one, we're not going to win. Yeah, and therefore, you know, you have to give them the right direction. That should be based on numbers rather than just gut feeling.
Yeah, that's good. I like the, because it's a balancing, right? I think it's all between, to your point, hiring the right people, the soft skill piece, man, that's such a hard one. It's one of the, it's funny. I was talking to somebody, asked me the other day, like, hey, can you give me advice? You know, it was like a advice for younger self. And I said the same thing around soft skills, because it's the thing that I like. Solving problems now for me is not overly hard. Probably, you know, doing some of the basic things for sales is not overly hard for you at this point, but it really is continuing to hone in on how you lead and how you lead across, you know, cross functions. It's not just your direct, you know, your direct reports, but also across organizations. And that one's really big. And obviously the data side, that's one that, you know, you and I have a natural leaning to, but I would say a lot don't. And so, you know, and also I think within that, it's a balancing act of saying, you know, quantitative data is not the end all be all. There's a qualitative component, and there's also a gut component. And I think it's really the balancing act between those that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so yeah, that's the reason why I love RevOps and it's still my hobby.
Well, hey, thanks so much for the conversation. It was a lot of fun. For those listening, you can follow like Heuer on LinkedIn. We'll make sure we put that on the post as well. If you're not already following the podcast, please like, subscribe. And again, thanks to everybody for joining today. Heuer, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Hit like, subscribe to continue to follow along as we get to impact change across our organizations in the industry. To the journey.